welcome. My name's Debbie from Sew So Easy, and today we're going to be pattern hacking. In fact, we're going to be pattern hacking one of my own patterns. This is the Turning Japanese bag. It's just a very simple bag, part of the My First Bag series. And as you can see, the whole thing is just one piece, front and back, the same pattern piece. The lining is exactly the same again, and it has these large grommet handles. And this is a very simple bag pattern. But we're going to make it a little bit different. Just because it starts off simple doesn't mean it has to be boring. And we can easily hack this pattern to include some extra bits and pieces and make it a lot more interesting. So I've picked out a few pieces of hardware. I've got this chain, so I want to add a chain to the bag so that I can use it as a shoulder bag. And I'll need some little hooks. So I've got these very small D-rings, and this is where my chain will hook onto on the bag. I want to make it removable so that it's not in use all the time. And I'm also thinking that I might add some of these nice bright gold bag feet to the bottom as well, just to give it a little bit of extra buzz, to make it look a little bit more professional. Anytime you add some of these ready-made hardwares, it makes the bag look a little less homemade and a little more professional, I think. So as the bag stands at the moment, it's just a simple handbag with no closures. You hold the grip at the top and there you go, that's it. What my intention is to make this into a fold over bag so that the top will fold over. It'll have little feet on the bottom and a little hook on either side here for adding a shoulder chain. I'm also going to make this second one without these handles, just using some plain bias tape to bind the edge of the handle. So if you don't have them, this is a good option for this bag. So I've decided that I like the shape of the bag like this. I can still use it as a handbag, but I can also make a seam here, allow it to flop over and use it as a shoulder bag as well. So let's make a look at how we're going to alter the pattern for that. So first off, I've just started with the Turning Japanese bag. It comes as a half pattern because you're going to cut it on the fold, but because we're going to pattern hack this, I've printed it out twice, so I've got two which are identical, and I'm just going to fold one side over and stick it on top of the other, and then I can create a whole piece, and that's going to give me a lot more flexibility in terms of how I want to change the design of the bag. So let's just stick those two together, and then we'll have one whole pattern which represents each side of the bag, both the front and the back. So the first thing I need to do now is to decide where on my bag I want the fold to come, and it kind of has a natural fold that comes about there. So I'm going to measure this distance here. That is 1 3/4 inches, but of course the top of my bag pattern already includes a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so 1 3/4 plus a half is 2 1/4 inches. So I need to go down on the side 2 1/4 inches. So I'm going to just mark a line on one side of my pattern. Okay, so I've just measured down from this corner here 2 1/4 inches, and this is going to be where I want the fold of my bag to come. So now I'm going to take my gridded ruler, and the pattern here already has a centre line, so I'm going to line up one of the lines on the ruler with the centre line on the pattern, line up the top of the ruler with the mark over here, and once I've got everything square, I'll draw a line across. So this is where I want the fold on my new pattern to come, and it's also at the same point where I'm going to transition from one fabric to the next, because I actually want to have one fabric on this part of the bag, and then the top part that folds over, I actually want that to be in a different fabric, just for a different look. So this will help us to do that. So I've drawn this line here. Now there are two ways you can do this. You could either cut the pattern and add on a seam allowance of 1/2 inch to each piece, stick a new piece on the back and make a new pattern piece. So you could do that, and then you could use each of your new pattern pieces to cut out your fabric. But I always like to do things the quick and simple way, and so what I'm going to do is just join my fabric together and once I've done that, then we'll cut them out as a whole using this guideline. So I've got these two fabrics which I'm going to have a go at for this bag. It's all a bit of an experiment, so hopefully it'll come out well. So I want this fabric at the bottom, and I'll have this fabric as a contrast up at the top. So if I take a look, I can see that below the line, this part I've got 8.5 inches, and therefore I need to now a little bit, say half an inch from my seam allowance, which would make 9, and I'm going to give myself another ½ inch of wiggle room. So I'm going to have a 9.5 inch piece of fabric here. So I need to cut a piece of fabric which is as wide as my pattern and 9.5 inches down. So I'll do that first of all. So now I need a piece of fabric for the top. I'll take my ruler. The top is 4.5 inches. I want to have ½ inch for a seam allowance to make 5, ½ inch of wiggle room. So I'm going to cut a piece of fabric which is as wide as the pattern and 5.5 inches deep. So my two pieces are cut. This is going to be the bottom part of the bag, this is going to be the top, and you join those together and sew them here with a ½ inch seam, and then when you open out you'll have your piece of fabric ready. So this is what it looks like when it's done, and I've already gone ahead and added the interface into the back of mine. So now, although it looks a little bit odd, when we put our pattern piece on top, we can now use this line here to line up with the seam line between the two fabrics that we've sewn, and it's going to make it much neater and more accurate, because now we know exactly that these pattern pieces are all going to fit beautifully. So I will just weight this down and then cut out around my pattern piece. Do the same for these others, and then the outside will be cut. Now, going forward with the instructions for sewing the bag, the original video that I did as part of the My First Bag series was very detailed because it was intended for people who maybe hadn't sewn many bags before. Now this one is going to be just a quick run through. I'm not going to go in as much detail because this one really will just deal with the variations, how you can hack the pattern, add in some extra hardware and make the bag a little bit different. So if you do need some more information, much more detailed about how to sew the bag, then I'll refer you back to that original video. Maybe watch that one first so that you know how to sew, and then just use this one in terms of the variations. So one more good thing about not cutting up the pattern earlier and just using this line as a guide is that I can still use that same pattern piece to cut out my lining fabrics. So I don't need to do anything to it, it's just exactly as it is, and I've cut two pieces of lining. Now for this one I'm just going to make a very simple patch pocket. But because the top of the bag is going to be designed to fold over a little bit, I want to make sure that I'm going to use the placement line here to make sure that the pocket isn't too high up, because we don't want it too close to the handle or to the point where it's going to fold over, but at the same time we don't want it right down at the bottom here either. So I can use my pattern piece and just place my pocket somewhere around here, and I'm just going to stitch around those sides now, and that'll be my pocket in place. So now it's time to start our construction. I'm just going to quickly go through the construction steps again. So we need to match one side of our outer panel with one side of the lining, and we put them right sides together. And then up at the top here, we need to pin the lining in place around this curve. Here's one I've already done. So I've pinned around the top curve here, and we sew with a ½ inch seam all the way from one side seam here, up around the curve and over to here, and repeat that for both sides. Once the lining and the right sides are sewn together, the next step is to clip the curves. So I've clipped into the curve all the way around the top from one side to the other. This is going to make the bag sit a lot neater along the top once it's turned out. So do that on both of your pieces, and then it will be time to start the assembly. Now we're going to sew the bag together, and if you take the lining piece and fold it up, of course it won't fold all the way because it's stitched at these points here and here. So just smooth that nice and flat. Exactly the same for the other lining piece, and then we're going to put them right sides together. Now, I'm not a very careful or accurate sewer, I'm quite rubbish at that. However, we want to try and make it look as neat as possible. So what we need to do, rather than worry about what goes on at the bottom of the bag that we're not going to see so much, we want to make sure that our top seams are level. So at these points here, either side of the point where the two join, I'm just going to put a pin either side there. Match up exactly the same on the other side. I'll match where these two seams are here and put a pin either side in the outer and in the lining fabric. And then when we smooth this out, I'll continue to pin down the side seams and across the bottom on the outer fabric all the way around. For the lining, we need to leave a gap for turning. So I will leave a gap in my side seam just here, and I'll remind myself by just putting some pins in at a bit of an angle, so then I know to leave a gap here in the lining for turning. And now I'm going to sew all the way around. So I'll sew down the side seams from one side to the other. Remember to leave a gap in one side. I'll sew along the bottom of the bag and the lining and down this side. But these points here, which are going to be the depth of our bag on the front and the lining, well, leave those unsewn, and we'll do that in the next step. Now it's time to give our bag a little bit of volume, and we're going to box the corners so that it has a flat part on the bottom. And to do that, if you open up this square, and we want to put these two seams together. So we have a side seam and a bottom seam, and we're going to butt those up together. I find it easiest to put one seam allowance to one side, one to the other side, rather than opening them out. And then I will put a pin on either side, and it makes a bit of a cross. But what we're going to do is sew from all the way across from one side over to the other, and we'll do that on all of the four corners of the bag, and then it will give us a little bit of volume. Then our next step is going to be to turn the bag the right way out and see how we're going. Okay, so I've turned my bag right side out through the bottom of the line, through the opening in the lining, and now we can see it's taken shape. It's got our boxed bottom just here. We've got our curves around the top, but the lining's all kind of loose and baggy, and everything's not really looking very sharp at the moment. So just fuss around with your fingers, just fuss these edges, make sure the curves and everything are nice and smooth and flat. Make sure the seam allowances inside are smooth. And once you have everything nice and as you would like it, then it's time to take this over to the ironing board, and I'm going to press the whole bag. I'm going to press these side seams just here so they're nice and flat, and pay a special attention around the top of the bag just here. I want to make sure that this is turned in so that the lining is on the inside and not peeking through, and I'm going to press all over it until I get a nice crisp edge all the way around the top of the bag. Okay, the pressing is done. It looks a lot sharper and neater around these edges now. So now it's time to top stitch. Start at one side seam, so following the curve with a narrow seam, maybe 1/4 of an inch or so, all the way around the top, all the way around the other side, and stop again at the side seam. And then we'll move on to adding some of our hardware next. So the top stitching around the edge of the bag is now completed all the way around, and it's time to start adding in some hardware. And the first thing I'm going to do is add in a hard bottom to the bottom of the bag so that I can put in some bag feet. So I've measured the bag from here on each side to measure the width like this. I've also measured the length, and I've cut myself a piece of foam board. There's all sorts of things that you can use. If you just have a stiff cardboard, then that does absolutely fine. There's some kind of like plastic canvas product that you can get too. Can't get that here, so I've just used a piece of foam board, and we've still got this gap in the lining, so I can feed that through the gap in the lining. Pop my hand down inside too. There we go, and I will feed it into the corner on this side, feed it into the corner on the other side. Make sure the seam allowances are flat in there, and then it's right down in the corners at the bottom of the bag. Okay, pull my hand out for now. Okay. So at the moment it's kind of loose in the bottom of the bag. You can see the firm base in there if I pull the fabric taut, but we're going to use the bag feet, and that's going to help the base stay exactly where it should be and create a little more shape and stability to the bag as well. So I've got my bag feet just here. We'll use 4. And they come like this with 2 legs which open out. Or at least if I could. So I've got my hand down on the inside of the bag again, between the bag and the lining, and I'm just holding this piece of foam board in place. And I've made 4 marks, so I've measured with my ruler where I want my bag feet to be, and I've made 4 marks on the outside of the fabric. Now I need to punch through, and I've got this very old and nasty looking but impressive tool, which is extremely dangerous. So do be careful with this, but I'm going to keep my fingers well out of the way and then punch through, and I'll punch through the fabric and through the foam core, and I will make all 4 holes, and then we'll stick the bag feet in place. So I cut my 4 holes off camera just in case there was any horrible accident followed by screaming and bleeding, but no, everything went smoothly. So now I've got my bag feet, and once I'd had a chance to actually put my spectacles on and see, of course they have the 2 legs, and one leg is usually a little shorter than the other, and I was trying to open it the wrong way without my glasses on, so typical. Now even with the prongs slightly open, they're going to slip through the fabric, slip through the hole I've cut in the foam board, and I've now just popped all 4 in place. And now I'm just going to get my finger on the inside. If I push here, and then on the inside I can open up those legs, and that holds the foot in place, and it also holds the firm base in place on the bag too. So if I finish with all 4 of those, plus anytime you add these little bits of hardware, it makes your bag look a little bit more professional, a bit more store-bought rather than homemade. Last one. Okay, so now on the inside the bag, those prongs are all opened out, and our bag feet are now completed. I really like the gold with this fabric, it looks very nice. So our next job is going to be to attach these tiny little D-rings onto the side of the bag. Now you can obviously get much bigger ones, but I've bought these very small ones. They have a 1/2 inch gap just here, because when the bag is being used without a strap, I didn't want them to just be hanging around on the side and be too noticeable. So I've got the small ones, but of course they're quite fiddly to apply. So let's have a look at what I've done. So I've started off with a small square fabric. It's just 2 inches square, and using my iron, I've pressed both sides into the centre and then pressed again so that it's 4 pieces thick. And I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and along the open edge just here, just take some running stitches from top to bottom. So it's as though you were making a strap for a bag, a fabric one, but in teeny tiny size. So we'll do that step first, and then we'll make a loop. So my teeny tiny piece is now sewn along this edge, and I'm going to take the little D-ring and just pass the fabric through and fold it over in half. And now what we need to do is just secure these ends, and I found the easiest way to do it was to select a zigzag stitch, which is quite small and close together, and just zigzag backwards and forwards over these ends to make sure those are nice and strong. Here's one I did earlier. It's not a terribly neat job, but we aren't actually going to see that, because once it's sewn we now need to turn it inside out. So if I just roll it, and we'll end up with that little seam on the inside. Quite fiddly. We'll roll the D-ring out to the top, and that seam is down at the bottom. It's hard to get the camera to focus on something so small, but here we are. This is my little strap. The seam is at the bottom just here, but it's tucked on the inside, and the D-ring is up at the top. And now I need to secure this onto the side panel of the bag. Now throughout the the practice for this bag, I've made quite a lot of mock-ups for it and tried various different ways of sewing it in during construction, sewing it to side seams and things. But it seems easiest and more sensible to actually sew this on afterwards. So I'm going to sew it now onto the side of the bag where the side seam is. So I've got my bag and I've decided where I want my strap to come. And I'm going to have the top of the D-ring coming just below where the two fabrics change, just here. So all I need to do now is just pop my hand down inside the lining, between the lining and the bag, through that gap, and I'll hand stitch this in place. I'll push the needle through from this side, use my hand on the inside to push it back out, and stitch along this bottom part here so that I can stitch just this little thing in place on the side of the bag. So my little tabs are now sewn onto the side on each of the side seams. And of course, if you don't want to do this, you can just make the little tab, don't bother about finishing the end, and when you sew the side seam, you can just pop it in the side seam then and it'll be just fine. But I liked mine like that. And now we can take the clip from the chain, and it's got a little clip on, so we can just put that on here on either side and it can stay on or come off. Okay. So that's that part done. Our next part is to go back inside now and close this gap in the lining. We've got the gap just here that we've left open. So now I'm just going to pull that tight between these 2 points, fold in those raw edges, and either hand or machine stitch this gap in the lining closed. So our last step now is just going to be the handles. Now on the earlier bag, I've used these metal grommet handles, and if you're going to make this fold down version, I really recommend that you go for the metal handles, because as you can see, when you fold it over, the weight of the handles keeps the bag folded over and closed at the top, and plus they're really awesome anyway. But I only bought the one set, so now what I'm just going to make this other one, I'm going to bind my handles with some bias tape, and if you don't have the grommets, of course, then you can do that as well. But if you are making a version where you want to hold it from a strap and fold down at the top, the metal handles will work better for it. So I've got my pattern, and up at the top just here where the hole is for the handle, I've now cut that out of the pattern, and I'm just going to place it up on top of the fabric. Now of course, remember that the pattern includes a small seam allowance, so I'm going to let it hang over the top just a little bit and decide if I'm happy. I think so. That's where I want my handle to be. Okay, now I can just draw it with a marker, because we aren't going to see this line anyway, it will be covered up. Okay, so now I've got my line drawn, and I can see it on the fabric just about here. I'm going to do a line of stitching just all the way around here, but just on the outside of that line, because this line will be my cutting line, and in order to stabilize the fabric, if I draw a line of stitching all the way around, it's going to stop all the layers from shifting. So I'll do that first, and then we can cut out this hole. So my line of stitching is in, so now I'm going to cut out the hole that we marked. So I'll start off with the seam ripper, just enough so that I can get my scissors in, and then I'm going to follow the line that I drew earlier. I'm not snipping through the stitching that I did, because that's holding all my layers together, and I can cut out this oval shape, and this will form my handle. And we're going to put our bias binding around there. Make sure I'm going through all the layers. So now it's time to add the bias tape around your handles, and I admit, please don't look at my faults. If there's one thing I am really bad at, it is applying bias tape, especially around curves. And especially on here, these curves are quite tight on the inside. So hopefully you'll be able to do a slightly better job than mine. I actually sewed mine on around the outside by machine, and I think actually sewing it by hand is going to be better. So sew your bias tape around the outside, overlap it a little at the bottom just here, and then when you turn to the inside, Again, mine's not the neatest job in the world. I've used too dark a thread just so you can see the stitching around here, but then just stitch the inside of the bias tape. So here I've sewn it on around the outside, and you can see my pins just here as I've pinned it around the edge on the inside, and now I'm just going to hand stitch that in place, and then my handles will be completed. Again, if you're newer to sewing, or like me, not too great at applying the bias tape, you would be better off buying the metal handles, because they really are very easy, and they also give the bag a much neater finish, especially if your bias is like mine. So once the handles are done, our bag is completed. The only thing we need to do is add on our shoulder strap. I've got this really nice chain that I like, and I'm going to put the link for all the materials underneath the video, so you'll be able to use the same ones if you like these. And there we go. My bag's completed, so it's now got a few additions. It has the bias handles. We've used the little chain hangers on the side so that we can have a removable chain. We've added some bag feet to the bottom and used the different fabrics. Now when we use the pattern for this one, going back here, remember I drew my line here and we split our fabrics up at the top of the bag, so we've got a top and a bottom out of the different fabrics. But there's no reason when you have a simple bag pattern like this that you have to put a line here. So if you wanted to make it a little bit more interesting and make the fabric divide go diagonally across the bag, so you wanted your fabrics split this way, then there's no reason you can't do that either. You could split it this way, put a zip in and have a diagonal zipper pocket. So basically you can take a very simple pattern and you can use it to split up the pattern this way and add in different fabrics. So I hope you've enjoyed watching just a few variations today on the Turning Japanese bag, and I hope you'll join me over at Sew So Easy and we'll sew some more exciting projects together. Thank you for joining me.